On May 7th, 1989, WCW held a pay-per-view called WrestleWar, which had the subtitle of Music City Showdown since it took place in Nashville. That Music City Showdown tagline would prove apropos, as there was some heated conflict within the confines of Music City itself that night. But the most contentious battle didn't come between any two given wrestlers on WCW's roster, rather it came when WCW and WWF waged war that weekend inside Nashville city limits. But before we get into that moment in time, a history lesson. A year and a half earlier, in November 1987, WCW, under the NWA banner, entered into the pay-per-view market with its 5th annual Starrcade. Vince McMahon saw WCW's attempt at peacefully doing business as an affront of some kind to his own empire, and felt that this microaggression should not stand. He then created Survivor Series, scheduling it for the same night as Starrcade and forcing cable providers to choose one over the other. To strengthen his standing, McMahon decreed that those providers who sided with WCW would not be getting WrestleMania 4 the following spring. The result? 7 million American households were able to air Survivor Series against just 300,000 for Starrcade. The maneuvering continued 2 months later when McMahon counter-programmed WCW's second pay-per-view, Bunkhouse Stampede, with the inaugural Royal Rumble on free TV via the USA Network. Here, both companies actually fared well. With a national pay-per-view audience all to themselves, Bunkhouse Stampede did a buy rate 10 times that of Starrcade's paltry 20,000 buys, while the Royal Rumble became the highest-rated program in USA Network's history. For their part, WCW was willing to fire back. In March 1988, on the same night as WrestleMania 4, the first ever Clash of the Champions aired on TBS. Capped off by Sting's career-making performance in a 45-minute time-limit draw with world champion Ric Flair, the Clash was widely considered the better event of the two supercards. Though WrestleMania still managed to pull in 485,000 buys, the highest for any WWF event yet. In February 1989, WCW staged their 5th overall pay-per-view effort, the Chi-Town Rumble, in which Ricky Steamboat captured the NWA World Heavyweight title from Flair in the first battle of their acclaimed 3-match series. The card aired on a Monday, and on that same night the WWF countered by ramping up their weekly primetime wrestling telecast, making it a special 3-hour edition with appearances from both world champion Macho Man Randy Savage and WrestleMania 5 opponent Hulk Hogan. It's kinda hard to fault WWF here because it's not like WCW had to put their event on a Monday. But in addition, 2 days before the Chi-Town Rumble, WWF themselves ran in Chicago, putting together a loaded-up house show featuring Hulk Hogan vs. the Big Boss Man inside a steel cage, and world champion Macho Man Randy Savage against Bad News Brown in a street fight. The untelevised WWF card drew 19,000 fans to the Rosemont Horizon, while WCW's pay-per-view brought in 8,000 fans to the much smaller UIC Pavilion. 1 year after inventing the Clash as a necessary weapon, WCW again tried fighting for space with WrestleMania, but got slaughtered this time around. The 6th ever Clash of the Champions emanated from the New Orleans Superdome, but it managed to draw only 5,300 fans to the cavernous stadium for round 2 of Flair vs. Steamboat. Compounding that bitter pill was WrestleMania 5, raking in 767,000 buys, a WWF record that stood for close to 10 years. The Clash's rating, meanwhile, dipped significantly from the year before. So yeah, WWF and WCW liked to counter-program against each other. With all the other viable territories dead and the AWA getting buried alive, the WWF only had one real rival left. And with or without Ted Turner's money propping them up, McMahon was still going for their throat. 5 weeks after WrestleMania 5 greatly overshadowed the Clash, WCW returned to pay-per-view with their latest endeavor, the aforementioned WrestleWar in Nashville, built on the foundation of the final chapter of Steamboat vs. Flair. It felt like your typical WCW show of the era, with Sting, the Road Warriors, and Lex Luger in title bouts. The only thing on WrestleWar that really stood out from the norm was an in-show mini-concert from country music legends the Oak Ridge Boys. It's worth noting that WrestleMania 5 had Run DMC, so apparently 1989 was the year of the pro wrestling halftime show. A quick digression here, the funny thing was WrestleWar wasn't originally intended to take place on May 7th. Ted Turner was going to have it oppose WrestleMania 5 on April 2nd instead of the Clash on free TV that we got. In February 1989, the major pay-per-view outlets approached Turner about running his own pay-per-view on April 2nd, the same night as WrestleMania, with the promise that they would carry it over McMahon's veritable pro wrestling Super Bowl. It must have sounded almost too good to be true if you were WCW, and in fact, it was. Vince McMahon was hardballing the providers, demanding a larger share of the revenue split for WrestleMania, which the cable providers were reluctant to agree to. The providers asked Turner to throw his hat into the ring with his own pay-per-view for the same date, not telling him that he was just a pawn being used to coerce McMahon into lowering his asking price. In the end, both wrestling companies had to swallow their pride. McMahon agreed to a smaller cut of the revenue in order for providers to carry WrestleMania, and Turner had to accept that he'd been duped by the cable companies solely as a means to their end. So WCW's WrestleWar would instead run the following month on May 7th at Nashville's Municipal Auditorium. As for the WWF, there weren't any pay-per-views on their docket until SummerSlam in August. Their next Saturday night's main event was already taped but wouldn't air until 3 weeks after WrestleWar. No cable TV specials were going to be invented in order to jostle with WCW's offering, so it seemed that Sunday, May 7th, 1989 was going to belong to WCW and WCW alone. Well, the day may have belonged to them, but the weekend didn't, and neither did the building. Following WrestleMania 5, WWF taped a few weeks worth of television before most of the roster took 3 weeks off from the road, save for a select handful that briefly toured Italy in April 1989. Upon resumption of the touring schedule, as per normal, the roster was divided up into 3 different troops. An A show headlined by world champion Hulk Hogan, a B show headed up by the Intercontinental Champion, in this case Rick Rude, and a C show in a smaller market with generally a smaller selection of matches. Vince really liked to cover as much of the continental US as humanly possible at one time. This touring loop began 2 weeks before WCW's WrestleWar and spanned much of the eastern half of the United States, with McMahon's deep roster able to cover lots of ground. On Saturday, May 6th, the WWF ran 3 cities as per its norm: Indianapolis's Market Square Arena, Green Bay's Brown County Arena, and Nashville's Municipal Auditorium. Yes, the same Nashville Municipal Auditorium where WrestleWar would take place the following day, with a late afternoon start time. The big 2 promotions were running a weekend twin bill in the same venue. They may have run Chicago close together in February, but that was 2 days apart, and 2 different buildings as well. This was a little bit different of a scenario, and probably not a coincidence on WWF's part. But what could the WWF really do to hurt WrestleWar? Well, they could certainly take away from the walk-up ticket sales. A fan who has enough money to attend only one show could be more tempted by the WWF lineup, choosing them over WCW. But aside from that, it's not like they're putting up their own pay-per-view against WrestleWar, right? How much more sabotage could WWF really attempt? Maybe it's unfair to call it sabotage, but what WWF ended up doing is probably the equivalent of a wet willy with a sharpened fingernail. WWF's A and B shows the day before, on February May 5th, took place in St. Louis and Washington, D.C. The DC show featured Bret Hart vs. Mr. Perfect, Rick Martel vs. Tito Santana, Demolition defending the tag team belts against the Twin Towers, and Ultimate Warrior challenging the man who beat him for the IC title, Rick Rude. Since Hogan didn't appear at either event, this Washington card was probably the A show. Over in St. Louis, WWF put on a reasonable card featuring Macho Man Randy Savage against Brutus Beefcake and Ted DiBiase vs. Jake Roberts as the night's 2 major bouts, with an objectively average undercard. The wrestlers from that show would work in Indianapolis on Saturday, while the talent on the previously mentioned DC card, Warrior vs. Rude, Brett vs. Perfect, etc., were headed to Saturday's Nashville event at the site of WrestleWar. To try and counter the WWF Saturday night card in the same building, WCW put together a special autograph signing and t-shirt giveaway at the Hickory Hollow Mall in a Nashville suburb, which took place the same time as the Federation's house show. The event was attended by several thousand people and was considered a rousing success, no doubt inspiring 8-year-old Conrad Thompson, who still probably had a beard even in grade 2, to one day start his own wrestling podcast / fanfest empire. But WWF, they had a counter to the counter, and their counter came equipped with a cornucopia of pre-rigged counters. That's probably over-dramatizing it a bit, but yeah, they were determined to win this weekend, and they were going to go to great lengths to do so. In addition to the already impressive lineup that was booked for Nashville, the WWF chartered a flight for the 4 top wrestlers on the Indianapolis card: Savage, Beefcake, Roberts, and DiBiase. They were being flown to Nashville for the Saturday night card and had their matches riveted onto the end of the advertised event. All of a sudden, WWF was tempting the local crowd with 2 late additions in the form of Randy Savage vs. Brutus Beefcake and Jake Roberts vs. Ted DiBiase, on top of Warrior vs. Rude, Demolition vs. the Twin Towers, Santana vs. Martel, and more. And bear in mind those 4 stars worked twice that day, as early as possible on the card in Indianapolis, and then chartered into Nashville for their second act. And with this pretty impressive cache of talent on hand for the Nashville card, the WWF has one general order for the night: stall. It just so happens that a young Dave Meltzer was in Nashville that weekend to attend WrestleWar and also went to the WWF show the previous night. His report of the show revealed the lengths WWF went to stretch out their own event, giving WCW far less time to set up for the following afternoon's pay-per-view. Bret Hart and Mr. Perfect fought to a time-limit draw in the evening's third match, which is admittedly what they'd been doing at house shows around the circuit at the time. Immediately afterward, Hillbilly Jim defeated the Honky Tonk Man via disqualification in a match where both men didn't make contact for the first 6 minutes. The IC title bout pitting Rude against Warrior saw more in the way of slowed down wrestling, complete with extended bear hugs and such. The clock crept past 10:30 PM when preliminary talents Jim Powers and Iron Mike Sharp were sent out to kill time for a bit, reportedly because they were still waiting for the 4 sudden headliners to get in from Indianapolis. After Demolition defeated the Twin Towers in what would have ostensibly been the main event, out came the 2 bonus matches. It was beyond 11 PM when Savage and Beefcake took to the ring, the 2 wrestling in their second match of the day. Savage won via chicanery from Sensational Sherry, paving the way for the main event. In a match that Meltzer referred to as virtually all rest holds, Roberts cradled DiBiase for the win, fulfilling each man's double duty and ending the show sometime well after 11:30 PM local time. So ended what was a rather elaborate, and if I must say so, impressive bit of passive-aggressive pettiness on WWE's part. One has to think that if the WWF could have gotten away with staging Roberts and DiBiase in a 3-hour Iron Man match, they probably would have. So what was the payoff to all this silliness? Well, there really was none. WrestleWar did a comparable buy rate to the pay-per-views that surrounded it, which is to say not to WWF levels, but not a bed-staining embarrassment either. It was also less attended than the WWF house show, which had to be a little bit humbling. The WWF drew close to 8,000 fans for a building that seated around 8,500, so that's not too shabby. For WCW, however, they only drew 5,200 fans to the auditorium. They were already going to have less available capacity due to seats being blocked off for the in-show Oak Ridge Boys concert, but they still wound up with 65% of the audience WWF pulled in, for a pay-per-view no less. In fairness, it's pretty hard to place any blame on attendance to the WWF's meddling. In 1989, they were the more popular promotion by a country mile, and Turner had to settle for second place for a long time to come. There didn't seem to be much in the way of similar shenanigans in the coming years. WWF and WCW mostly put on their ensuing pay-per-views without interference or hindrance from the opposition. No Clash of the Champions or dual running of the cities out of spite. But in wrestling, spite doesn't rest forever. The Flair World Title fiasco in WWF, the big money signings of Vince's biggest stars by WCW, and of course, the Monday Night Wars were all to come. But until those future days came to pass, this was a hearty slice of primordial spite, proving that you didn't need Eric Bischoff, dueling Monday night broadcasts, and an industrial paradigm shift for the WWF and WCW to take up arms against each other, no matter how childishly.